welcome to Real Film Snobs. I'm Angela Yeager. This is a really special episode for me today and for all of you because we are joined here on the show by my mentor and I think friend as well, distinguished professor of film studies at Oregon State University, Jon Lewis. Welcome to the show, Jon.
Oh, thanks. Hi. Hi, Angela. Yes, friend. Yes.
Yes. And so Jon was my great mentor when I was getting my master's degree at Oregon State. He is a film historian, author of many books, and I'm super excited to have him on the show today and to talk about his newest book, which we'll have a nice image of, but I also want to show you that I have my own copy. It is called Road to Nowhere: Hollywood Encounters the Counterculture. And it is out now, available in all of your favorite bookstores. I got mine through Powell's because I want to support the local stores. So we're going to be talking a little bit about Jon's new book, and then reviewing and talking about three of the movies that feature prominently in the book. So Jon, I'm really excited to talk to you about the book. I just finished it last night,
Wow.
so I
Awesome.
was right down to the wire. But I'm really interested. You know, a lot of your well, and I wouldn't say all. I'd say most of your work has really featured and focused on kind of that post World War II. Hollywood movie period. What in particular inspired you to write on this topic?
A couple of things. I had just written a book on the 40s and 50s called Hardboiled Hollywood. And rather than focus on, topics that people who write histories of that era tend to focus on, so the blacklist, film noir, I decided to see what happened to people who didn't make it in Hollywood, who went out there and for some reason things didn't work out, and then to try to examine those reasons. And that book began with the Black Dahlia killing, because Elizabeth Short, who was later became known as the Black Dahlia after her death, in this still unsolved murder, she was a Hollywood wannabe, and she came out with certain dreams that she'd make it in Hollywood, and then discovered that the studio system had sort of unraveled in the meantime and kind of couldn't find her way. And I followed her in the very beginning of the book, and then told other similar stories as I worked my way through. And I talked about gangsters who were really interesting and had an interesting role in Hollywood at the time. And I started thinking about the era after that, and thinking about the counterculture. And I was particularly fascinated with one actor at the start, an actor named Christopher Jones, who was so terrific and then just kind of vanished off the face of the earth. And I thought, oh, well, he kind of fit that pattern, somebody who had everything in his locker to make it and then didn't. So I was wondering, whatever happened to Christopher Jones? And then the book sort of got a little bigger because I found these other stories that were sort of like his. And so it became a second and I guess a series of books telling Hollywood history, but rather than focusing on the best and the brightest, I focused on those who, for one reason or another, it kind of didn't work out for them.
Yeah, and I am interested. Why did you become so interested in Christopher Jones in particular? Because I have to admit I had no familiarity with him at all, and I feel like I know a lot about movies. I was not familiar with his work. What about him was so particularly interesting to you?
Well, I was 13 when Wild in the Streets came out, his breakthrough film. So I doubt I saw it when I was 13. And I don't know when I first saw it, but it's a really interesting kind of, it's typical of an era at a studio called American International Pictures, AIP, which was owned by a guy named Sam Arkoff, who I actually worked for in Hollywood when I was a grad student.
You worked for Arkoff?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, AIP had by then been disbanded, and he was a new AIP, which was Arkoff International Pictures. So he kept the same acronym. It was a completely different company. And I worked for one of his line producers as a reader. I read scripts for them. And so I guess I have 1 degree of separation from Arkoff, who I never met, but I met one of his producers. And anyway, so I have lost my train of thought, but I don't remember when I first saw this film. But I remember after having seen it, thinking, that guy, that actor in that, he's quite something. And I did know, because I'm a film historian. I mean, I did know that a lot of people who became mainstream stars had apprenticed at American International Pictures. So Jack Nicholson, Ellen Burstyn, Karen Black, Bruce Dern, Peter Fonda. I mean, they were all at AIP working on the cheap. Scorsese and Coppola both got their starts at AIP.
Right.
So, I mean, everybody, Peter Bogdanovich, everybody was there. And then, so I've been for a long time thinking, whatever happened to this guy? And I'd seen one other of his films, also an AIP film called Three in the Attic, which was this very sort of strange little exploitation film, also done at AIP, where Jones played this Lothario, this sort of campus Lothario, who's basically three-timing these three very different, beautiful women. And they find out about each other and they lock him in the attic and turn him into their sex slave. Mm-hmm. I've just, the movie is so wonderfully ridiculous. And
reading the description in the book is super entertaining. Having not seen it, your description of it just, yeah,
it is streamable. I mean, these films are hard to find, which is also a problem, I guess, if after people watch this and they want to see one of these films. But Three in the Attic's on Paramount Plus now, so it's gettable, it's seeable. So I'd seen that, and then I guess I sort of had it in the back of my mind that I was always interested in this guy. And then when I was thinking, oh, well, maybe I could do the same methodology on a different era, on the counterculture era, maybe I'll write something about Christopher Jones. And then when Once Upon a Time in Hollywood came out, in one of the interviews, Tarantino talks about Christopher Jones as like one of his favorite actors ever. And I thought,
It's so weird because, yeah. Okay.
Oh, I don't know. He's like, he's like the, think about, Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction. Tarantino rediscovers these sort of actors who are in B movies and sort of gives them a part in an A film. And he tried to cast Jones in Pulp Fiction, and Jones was. I'm giving away a little of the story, but he was a little too far gone by then. And I think even he knew better than to accept the offer to be in the film, because I think Jones himself knew that there was no way he could actually have the discipline to show up and play a part in a real movie. So he didn't. And then apparently after the film came out, Tarantino had tracked him down again, and they met briefly and talked briefly. So Jones just kept coming back, and then I read something online about him, and everything I read just kept getting me more and more intrigued. And what maybe in my head started as, the history of Hollywood in the late 60s, early 70s, according to Christopher Jones, became this now bigger story, where I look at, maybe 10 different, mostly actors and actresses who had everything and had done everything right to make it, which is not so easy, and then suddenly vanished off the face of the earth.
Right, with the exception of one person, the one success in your whole big book, which is Jane Fonda, who, of course, it seems like today is as popular as ever. She has her hit TV show on Netflix. She's out and about. She's still doing political activism with Roe v. Wade and, various other things. So it's really interesting. Of course, she's also the one with the deepest ties to old Hollywood, which I don't think is any coincidence. And you do put that in your book,
Yeah, I mean, maybe she was the most talented, or maybe she had the best combination of talent and connections and discipline. I think that's an underrated thing, because we tend to look at celebrities and the press always depicts them as these sort of out of control sort of divas. Making it in any business requires a degree of
hard work and discipline.
And that's what, in the end, that's what undid Jones, I think. He realized, because he was on one big A movie, Ryan's Daughter, which was, from David Lean, who was maybe one of the most important filmmakers in the world at the time. And the production basically convinced Jones never to be in anything again. I think Fonda had boatloads of talent, or has boatloads of talent, but also had a kind of discipline, and also was had a relentlessness, that she was indomitable. There's a story I tell in the book, and I think it's my favorite Jane Fonda story. She went to a climate change rally outside, I think it was a power plant or something, and she had a big, heavy wool coat with her. She didn't need it for the weather that day, but she had it with her because she knew she was going to get arrested, because she had been told
she was prepared. Yeah.
And when the press interviewed her, he said, like, what's with the coat? She said, well, the beds in prison are really hard. She was celebrating something like her 80th birthday at the time. And I thought, okay, that's pretty damn cool. And then somebody in the press said, after all these years of causes and protesting, do you think it's worth it? And she looked at the guy from the press and said, well, you're here.
Yeah, no, that was a great story in the book.
Yeah.
And there's so many great stories like that. Of course, it ends, and I know we need to move on to the reviews, but of the actual movies. But you get into the section, of course, about some of the women, including Fonda. Of course, my favorite film in that section is Wanda, which we'll be talking about shortly here. And then you kind of wrap it up with Charles Manson and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and which really does make it kind of come full circle. It was kind of like the movie industry's version of Altamont or whatever, So like the day the peace, love, and flowers was all over. I always think about Altamont and the Gimme Shelter movie that Maisels did, really showing the dark side of the violent side, really, of counterculture, and that's really what Manson brought to the party, so to speak. So I just thought it was a really interesting way to wrap it up, which you don't necessarily think all those people are going to have much in common.
Yeah, I mean, with Manson, we tend to look at him as this sort of lone madman who's sort of out in the hills, and he had his sort of two terrible events that he comes into the Hollywood community, and the murders at the Tate house, and then at the La Bianca house. But as I write about this in the book, that there were reasons why Manson was more significant to the Hollywood community than that, because they all knew him, or they knew someone like him. If you were doing illegal drugs in Hollywood, you either knew Manson or Watson, his sidekick, who was at both murders, participated in both murders, or both events, because there were several murders at both. But also, if you didn't know Manson, you knew somebody like him. You knew some kind of dirtbag dealer who was a lot more dangerous than you thought, and you thought it was cool. And I'm saying, you being celebrities thought it was cool to sort of dabble in not play acting as bad guys, but being around real bad guys. Well, Manson was a real bad guy.
Yeah, the reality came home to roost. Exactly. Well, let's get into the first film we're going to talk about. Why don't you go ahead and introduce Wild in the Streets for us?
Well, Wild in the Streets came out in 1968, and it was built around two events. One was the Sunset Strip riots, which had just preceded it, where a bunch of young people who had sort of inhabited the posh areas of the Sunset Strip, the store owners especially just wanted them out. And the sheriff's department came in and they instituted a curfew and then violently enforced it. So that was one thing, the sort of battle of the establishment against young people just trying to smoke dope and have fun on the Sunset Strip. And the second event was the sort of notion that you were old enough to go get yourself killed in Vietnam, but you weren't old enough to vote, because in 1968 you had to be 21 to vote. But you only had to be 18 to be drafted. And, that sort of basic illogical situation, which a lot of young Americans, myself included at the time, felt was unfair and ridiculous. This film talks about, well, we need to drop the voting age. And then the film exaggerates that by dropping it to, I think, 13 in the end, right? Or 16 or 15. And
It's 14 at the
oh,
end,
it's
but
14 in Fight. That's right, 14 in Fight. Yeah, because
14
they
in
keep
fights. Yeah.
changing it. They
Yeah. Yeah.
negotiate, which of course hasn't happened, but 18 did happen a few years later. Um, and they elect a rock star president, because of course, if you give kids the right to vote, they're going to elect a rock star president, played by Christopher Jones. And then like one of his first things is that he has mandatory retirement at 30, and then at 35, you're interred in a concentration camp and dosed with LSD, so you won't be trouble to anyone anymore. I mean, the film is so wonderfully crazy, and Jones is just so terrific in it. So if you haven't seen this movie, it's very hard to see, as you found
It's
out.
very, yeah, I found out the hard way because I went to go watch it on demand where it had been $4. It disappeared. But, thanks to the pirates of the world, I was able to find it on YouTube. So you can find it on YouTube, folks that are watching at home and are interested in this movie. Just Google Wild in the Streets full movie and you'll find it. And it wasn't a bad transfer. What was funny to me watching this, I'd never seen this film before. There's all these people that appear that you're like, oh, Shelley Winters, of course, playing the crazy, well, that's sort of neither. She was always playing crazy at this point in her
Yeah.
career, but playing his crazy mother. Richard Pryor, who I'm a huge fan of, shows that he's in his band. He's in the band and he's
Yeah.
hilarious in the few scenes he's in. It really is Christopher Jones's movie. He's playing, which you do point out in the book, a very like Jim Morrison type. I mean, when he does the stage scenes where he's singing, his body movements, everything reminded me of Jim Morrison so much that it actually, my husband and I were just chortling laughing at that. And then I have to
Yeah.
say, even though the movie is a B movie and it's totally ridiculous, I did kind of love the ending with the young kids. I just thought, oh, that's perfect. It's just like the perfect coda to the film to have like there are these because everyone's going to get older, right? And so now the really young kids, like 9-year-olds, are telling him, you're too old man. You're 22. You're ancient.
Yeah.
So it's just this kind of like it just keeps devolving, right? So
Yeah. I remember seeing the film and understanding, okay, well, this is, a B movie. It's for it was made for drive-ins. That's what it was for. And I think Jones, like a lot of these guys who are AIP, saw this as a rite of passage. You're in these kind of movies, and then you're going to be in a real movie, someday. And Jack Nicholson is the most exaggerated example of that very, the
speaking of
trajectory of
someone that
celebrity.
started in that and became successful, though, I mean, he and Fonda are
Yeah.
really the exceptions to the rule, right?
Well, yeah, no, there's a lot of, you'd be
Well, a lot of
surprised.
them became big. Yeah, it's true.
Yeah,
And
or big,
especially the directors
or
too. But then you have the Bob Rafelson. I was curious, you didn't talk a lot about him. He just passed recently. And he directed several of the movies you talk about, Five Easy Pieces and others. And he was very much that countercultural type director and then really had not much of a career after the 70s. It's kind of interesting.
yeah, Raffleson was a difficult character. He was part of this outfit called BBS
Mhm.
with two partners, and they did famously. Well, Raffleson produced Easy Rider, but then when they became BBS, they did Five Easy Pieces, King of Marvin Gardens, Last Picture Show. So they did some
Yeah,
really
great
amazing
films.
stuff.
Yeah.
And Nicholson was originally a writer, and he wanted to be a director, and kind of reluctantly just sort of acted in some things, and obviously the rest is history. But Jones, Mark Maron's interview show, he interviewed Bruce Dern recently, and again Jones' name came up, and not Maron. Maron had no idea what it was, but he said, "Oh, you were at AIP, and all these people were there," and Dern starts rattling them off, and then he says, "And Christopher Jones, he was the one we were all sure was going to make it."
Yeah. And didn't,
And you look,
obviously, as
well,
you,
you look at him,
yeah, you kind of wonder.
yeah.
Yeah, I almost kind of wonder if he'd stayed in B movies like Karen Black or something, if he had, because it did seem like going into the mainstream, like trying Ryan's Daughter is what really destroyed him in a way, or at least
I think
destroyed
so.
his will to do movies. If he had just stayed in little low budget movies, maybe he would have just become like a working actor.
Yeah.
So I know we need to move on, and I'm really excited to talk about our next movie, Wanda. So I'll let you introduce that one.
Yeah. Barbara Loden was a Broadway actress. And she was married to Elia Kazan, who did Streetcar Named Desire. He was also a Broadway director, but then a Hollywood director as well. And by then was pretty well known. And she appeared in After the Fall, the Arthur Miller play about Marilyn Monroe. And Loden played the Marilyn Monroe role. She's not called Marilyn in the play. And won a Tony and became, the next big thing in New York. And she went to Hollywood to become a movie star. And she was in a movie called The Swimmer with Burt Lancaster. And then she got cut out of the movie and replaced by someone else. And there was all we have is gossip to figure out why. And she was in, a place that a lot of actors are in. She's had a disappointment to start, but there's always going to be another role. So what to do with the next role? And she chose to make her own movie with money from a guy who owned a wildlife, one of these sort of wildlife reserve parks, like the one in Winston, Oregon, near us. And it cost probably less than $100,000 to make this movie. And it's a movie about a young woman from the Rust Belt, sort of kind of a rugged part of America, who amidst all this sort of the first wave feminism is just sort of clueless. She's just this sort of amazingly clueless, disinterested, disengaged character. It's a great movie, and it couldn't more obviously be the worst move she could have made at that moment in her career, because she never got to make another movie after that. Not only as an actor, as a filmmaker, as a writer, as in anything. She basically couldn't follow it up, and so she becomes another example, like Christopher Jones, who, for the purposes of my book, of someone who had everything. I mean, absolutely everything, and it just didn't work out.
I couldn't help it. I watched last night an interview. I love this film, by the way. So I've seen it twice. I love this movie. I'm probably rare in that way as a feminist who actually loves this movie. And I loved in your book how you point, and I could totally see it, how feminists like Pauline Kael would have not liked this character, because she's a completely passive character. But how refreshing to have a female lead character who's not likable. I mean, the character of Wanda has no likable traits. She is completely passive, but she's also just completely disaffected as well, and really shows this particular worldview that her character has, and she's just kind of floating through life, letting things happen to her. And that's, in itself, to me, is feminist. She's making a movie about a woman who's like a full-fledged character and not just supposed to be an iconic hero woman, So I love that about it. But I couldn't help but think of like someone who had a career like Cassavetes, making low-budget, character-driven pieces, and who got to make those kind of movies. And here, Barbara Loden comes out of the gate with a fantastic movie, but isn't given the chance to make another one. So
no, I mean, the movie has a cult following now, but it's even
not at
hard
the
to
time,
show.
though. Yeah.
No, and it's actually even. I saw the new transfer at the Portland Art Museum, and I was surprised how many people came. So the film had this kind of legendary, in those days it was very hard to see. Now there's a DVD out, but this was before the Criterion edition was out, and it's still, I mean, she's like, the Melville character, Bartleby the Scrivener, she's just, I prefer not to, it's like, the film is one of, I mean, Don DeLillo, one of the most famous novelists of the 20th century, wrote a piece about that movie. He was so moved by it. Yeah, so it's a great movie, but she's an example. I mean, she has everything. She was beautiful, she was talented. We're running out of time, and
It's okay.
and a very powerful husband, very connected husband, and
Couldn't make it happen. Yeah. It's
or didn't make it
interesting.
happen. I think in a lot of ways, in her case, she just simply, she knew exactly what she was doing to her career, and she was kind of happy doing it. So good for her.
Yeah. Well, the interview with Dick Cavett, which sounded much better than the interview you talk about in your book, by the way, because he's just a better interviewer. But it was clear he had also not seen the movie, so it was very funny because he's talking about it. She's like, "That's not what happened." So,
I know.
but they also show a clip from the movie, and it's like the worst clip possible. And I just thought, my God, they didn't know how to market this movie at all. They didn't know what, it was just obvious. So, but she was trying. She's out on the talk show circuit trying to promote this movie. And then they show a clip from it, and you're going, "Oh man, this is not going to sell anything."
No, and
So
then even when she talked to Mike Douglas, it was like, she said, "Oh, this is a woman, and she doesn't know what she wants, and things
I know she
happen
could
to her, but
describe
she
the
doesn't
plot.
do anything." Yeah, it was like the worst elevator pitch ever. But it is the
Hmm.
movie. She basically was being honest.
Right.
Um,
She just
you
didn't
know,
try to
sh
sex it up at all. Yeah. Speaking of sexing it up, our last film, and we have like a minute and a half to describe it, but we can
Okay.
do it. Clute, 1971. Donald Sutherland is the title character. He's a detective, and he's the least interesting part of the movie, by the way, investigating the disappearance of a business executive who puts him in contact. This investigation puts him in contact with Jane Fonda's high class call girl, and Jane Fonda, of course, won an Oscar for her portrayal in this movie of the character of Bree. I really like this movie. It's funny. I just watched this director did two other films, Parallax View and All the President's Men, that are all kind of what he calls the paranoia series. I just recently watched Parallax View by total coincidence because it was on Criterion, and I thought it was a pretty terrible movie. But all the
Oh,
President's Men,
really?
of course. Yeah, I thought Parallax View was not aged well. I think the problem is Warren Beatty in that movie, but that's a whole other segment to talk about. Jane Fonda is really good in this, in part, I think, because she admits to not knowing really how to play a prostitute in a way. She went and studied them and everything, but this was like as a feminist and as a from her background, this was a world way beyond her. And so she plays the character with such intelligence and kind of nervous energy that I feel like it gets at something that you don't normally see in this kind of stereotypical prostitute role.
Yeah. I mean, I, I've shown the movie in a film noir class because it's often thought of as this sort of
Kind of neo
part of
noir.
neo noir, 70s, so it's after noir period. Um, and it's written about a lot. So a lot of feminists talk about feminists not liking Wanda. They really did like Clute. So there's a lot of stuff from that era about Clute. But quickly, um, I think that what's interesting about it to watch it now is you can actually see what a good actor she is. She's really amazing.
Yeah, she's
She has this sort of nervous, kind of jittery
mm-hmm.
thing going. I mean, and she's not like that. This isn't like, we're not watching Jane Fonda play Jane Fonda. We're watching Jane Fonda play a kind of mixed up person, a person who kind of is trying all these things on and none of them are working for her. And in the end of the film, without giving it away, she makes a decision, but you're pretty sure it's not going to work out.
Yeah.
And she has a lot of plan Bs, but no idea how to actually enact them. And I think she really captures someone in this sort of state of flux. It's a really
Which,
brilliant performance.
interestingly, Fonda herself didn't end up like a lot of the characters in your book, Road to Nowhere. She didn't end up nowhere, but her character Brie in this film is sort of on that road to nowhere, which I like that
Yeah.
juxtaposition.
Well, thanks. Yeah,
So
the title. Thank you.
yeah,
I
and the book
appreciate it.
again, Road to Nowhere by Jon Lewis. I highly recommend it. Also, if you're buying some Jon Lewis books, I also recommend Hollywood versus Hardcore, which I think is maybe your masterpiece, one of your masterpiece books. One of the
Oh,
greatest books
thank you.
ever written about the blacklist period, which is just a subject I can read endlessly about. So thank you so
Well,
much for
thank
being
you.
on the show, John. I really appreciate it. I
My
hope you come
pleasure.
back and we can just talk movies sometime and review some other fun ones. So.
Sounds good.
Okay. Again, thank you for watching. This has been Real Film Snobs. Have a great day and great movies. Thank you.